some of you commented to me that you were surprised, but I think you've forgotten that even though I'm a woman and they're all men, I work on the diversity of American art. So that's what we're here today. And I couldn't refuse this chance to work on abstract renegades, the whole notion of you being rejected in the 70s first and then having your rise was something that was familiar to me with a lot of the work that I've done over the years. So I'm happy to be here and happy to talk with you. I have made questions for each of these gentlemen. You can look around and see what they've done, both early and late work, if you've just come to it now. And it's evident their expressive action is the power of what they bring to the art world. And I want to introduce each artist first, not through their visionary work, but through their words about their own work. So that's where I'm going to begin. And I offer the chance for each of you to respond. They're all quotes that I have found about each of you. And then I'll ask Bill if he has some quotes he'd like to add to it at some point. Eugene, the quote that I found that really helped me see your artwork was, "I admire painting that is rooted in the world." And for me, that was profound, and it really changed, particularly the painting behind us right here. And so that is the point of departure for many abstract artists, but not all artists begin in the world. Zachariah, you quoted Robert Motherwell to me just a few days ago and said that it was an important idea to you. And that is that abstraction is the collaboration of the artist with their concept and medium. And I think that is another point on that spectrum where you come together with your medium in your studio alone to do the work that you do. Sam. Sam and I know each other better. And Sam, I had to use this quote, so you're going to have to forgive me for, and because you may need to explain this, people will want to know. Sam has been quoted more than once saying, "A great painting must tremble. If you sit with it, it starts to acquire its own life. I want my paintings to become beautiful slowly and then stay beautiful." I have for Richard Kovic words published by you, and you say that his reductive linear vocabulary implies a return to beginnings, to the inscribing of linear marks as the most archaic of art making activities. His achievement has been to make line a medium of painting, which certainly is evident in the work that we see here. So I'll give you guys 30 seconds to respond if you want. Wonder where I got that. Many of the quotes came from ARTSPACE. I should recognize them in the interviews that were there.
I recognize that quote, although I can't in any concrete way remember her having said that. And of course, all categorical statements are kind of subject to revision. I think what I meant to say was that I felt like paintings are cultural objects. They exist in the society as sort of independent things. It's not necessary to understand anything about the artist, particularly from the point of view of the person looking at the painting. That's a diaphragm. I'm on the other side of that. But if you ask for my own motives on it, I sort of recognize that sentiment, although I don't know that I've practiced it perfectly.
And no one would ask you to do it perfectly, I'm sure. So, and I think John Connell, who's not with us, but whose work is here, may have the pithiest statement of all. "Beauty concealed under a wretched surface. This is my aesthetic, sensibility and inclination." And I never met him. I've seen his artwork and I've seen his work in catalogs. And this painting in the corner over here, Bud and Flowers of the Lotus, references a source in Zen Buddhism, but it also touched my heart moving here from San Francisco, that it's pretty clear to me that he brought with him from San Francisco some of the beat and funk aesthetic. And that's where I love this wretched surface. His materials express that, like many of the artists that preceded him. And he participated and celebrated that tradition that began in the 50s. And I've just recently been writing about this group from the 50s, and they were a very interesting group of people, and so were the mediums that they chose to work in, and he carried that on. And I think if you can't conjure that up, I'll just bring you some of the names from that era. An aesthetic that was celebrated as a tradition by the time that John Cannell was using it in his own artwork. Think about Bruce Conner, Jay DeFeo, Allen Ginsberg, Dave Brubeck, and Sly and the Family Stone. I think that's sort of covering the territory. And I think the aesthetic that he's referencing, because it's very soulful, but it is not always pretty. And I think that's what he means by that. I want to start with you, Bill, if you want to talk about the state of art in the 70s. I love thinking about all of you as renegades who were rejected and overlooked and not understood. And then through your lens of ARTSPACE, you brought attention to their work. But I also appreciate, and I want to say, because I've been reading a lot of ARTSPACE in the last 2 weeks, is that you also brought the art world to Santa Fe, that you were also reviewing exhibitions that were in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And there was a dialogue that you created between the artists here and the artists in a larger arena.
The whole concept of ARTSPACE was and part of the actual title of ARTSPACE, why call a magazine that, was this issue of space. It's for us out here in New Mexico, it's both our blessing. We all like having lots of space around us, space to make what you want to make, and nobody bothering you about it. But it's also isolating, and there's a lot of space between people and between art centers. And we're certainly very far from New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles or Chicago, places that have a better reputation for being major centers of art. So that was the concept. I mean, print publishing was, in the days before the internet, practically the only way that you could communicate and get the word out, and then also get information in and exchange it from all the various areas. So that was right there at the beginning, and along with that was the alternative space movement, the idea that the institutions didn't seem to be responding to what was going on. And I should say, though, that, in response to Dr. White, that the museum did play a very important role back in those days, in the early 70s. They held biennial exhibitions on an alternating basis between the New Mexico Biennial and the Southwest Biennial. It brought in people from Colorado and Texas and Arizona as well. So that those biennials were where we got to see what was really going on, what the artists were doing. And unfortunately, that had to, it sort of went by the way when they did a major renovation at the museum, and it never kind of got back to that concept. But it was very, very important in the early 70s. That's where we saw what was going on, because there weren't very many galleries for contemporary art. I just got really fascinated with what was happening around me and the art that was being made. And I began to write a column, just a review column for a weekly alternative newspaper called The Independent, the New Mexico Independent. And it was through that writing that, that I got to meet Bob Tomlinson and got involved in what was going on, just reviewing the shows. And I have with me the first thing that I wrote about Sam Scott. So in this little publication,
Complete with black and white pictures. And that's what I want to do. I want to bring you back to exactly that work because in looking at ArtSpace, I found that your work with them was about more than what was going on. It was finding the affinity between these artists, and that you talk about how they worked with the materiality of paint and the abstraction, and that was the common ground that you saw among this group of artists. And I'd like you to say more about that because that's what was unusual in it.
it was this sense of materiality and what that physical material of paint and how it was handled and how this kind of reaching and exploring this material and getting it to sort of rhyme with what your feelings are. And I think I wrote about Sam Scott's work that there's a sort of basis of a kind of material that is in fact entirely all spirit. That color, light is a spiritual medium, and it's this thing of coming out of just the physicality of our physical lives and all of our sores and all of our pains and all of our complications and difficulties and struggles. But reaching through all of that and finding ways to express aspiration and express the needs and the aspect, what you're searching for. So I think that was what unifies these guys, but it was the intensity with which they addressed this and the mastery of it.
So let's turn to some questions for you, each of you, if you want to address these questions about that idea, because abstraction was a pretty well-known in the 70s, except for here, it seems, and that was still forming. And I was visiting here, and I remember the first inkling of contemporary art and how shocking it was. My first trip to Santa Fe was in 1971. So I remember those days of coming to see more and more of this contemporary art that we're surrounded by here. So the title of this exhibition is Painterly Expressionists. What I want to know from each of you is, looking at your own art, what surprises or interests you about seeing your early work in this installation? Or something about what does your work mean to you now in the company of these artists that you find yourself? And this is getting back to this group notion of the things that you were wrestling with yourself, but your friends and colleagues were doing the same.
I just want to say something about the kind of intellectual premises of what we've been speaking about here, because I think that our kinship and the friendships we developed and the resources we found and the people who responded to us really were not particularly involved with this sort of kind of conceptual thinking so much. I think that we were refreshing simply partially because we were just different, and partially because we kind of characterized the kind of social reality of the period, this kind of migrant wanderer kind of moving through life in different locations and somewhat disrespectful of the old guys and the tradition and all that. So I think structurally, when you really look at the painting of each of us, it's quite different. Uh, and for example, I just was thinking about your reminding me of your remark about that was probably a kind of not such a kind remark, criticizing people who felt that they had the authority for their art coming from certain ideas that were being kind of carried out, a kind of intellectual program. And I guess I was kind of taking the position that the source comes from the other side in some way. And acknowledging that, it points up to the fact that we do actually quite different work. I mean, if you look at this show, which, it doesn't cover the whole territory, I mean, we each have done vast amounts of work. A lot of it will wind up in the trash bin of history, which is kind of a selection process that's superior to anything we say here. So, but, the premises are different, but the sourcing of the work and our attitude of sort of not being bound, particularly by a kind of traditional perspective, what the role of art was a communality, and we were kind of enjoying that sort of youthful kind of defiance. And I think that was part of the game.
This is Painterly Expressionist, and I think if you're not familiar with that kind of language, Expressionist was the renegade part of it, because that came from each individual artist expressing something that comes from within you. And if people were critical of abstraction, it was exactly that motivation, that it was centered not on representation or yes, yeah,
I get it. Let's start first with abstraction, and we'll go to the Latin, which is helpful, extremely helpful. Add, to remove from, strata, layers. So abstraction in its very earliest form was about the idea of removing the layers of narrative experience to essence, to the deep fundamental reality of consciousness. And that's what's always interested me, to try and find that promised non-promise of contact with what I would call fundamental reality. So that means that, well, we will acknowledge that art is big, it's not little. And there's a scale. Over here is narrative, pure narrative. And over here is pure essence, pure abstraction. And I've always felt that if you're going to lead this goofy life, you might as well be free. So I've enjoyed swinging that pendulum from pure narration, but to very, very deep abstraction at the level of people like wolves, some other people have achieved. So I would say that expression or expressionism as an idea is simply very deep feeling and a deep seriousness, a very deep, serious consecration of attention.
I think another way into abstraction is actually to talk about the art practice itself, to go back to Motherwell's statement about it's between you and the medium and your concept. And it's in that process of abstraction that people get lost in front of a painting that they expect to come to them. And it's my belief that the strongest way to approach abstraction is to begin with questions. What am I looking at? That kind of really basic things. How is this expressing to me? How am I feeling in front of this? So I would like you to talk about your art practice and the process of painting expressively and abstractly, and why abstract.
My work has always been for 60 years of painting is really about exploration. It's about working with the material and in a way, what I call the physics of paint. What my concerns are all metaphysical, but how do I say anything about the deeper issues? And that's the only way that I've found is through what paint wants to do if I can anthropomorphize it a bit. And so over the decades, I've worked in various genres and materials. When I first started out, I worked in abstract expressionism. The work was very raw in the 60s and often had assemblage materials attached to it. As I was in school, I did a lot of sculptural work, and the work became sort of a synthesis between painting and sculpture with various very billowing forms of canvas that were painted, so they become three-dimensional. Maybe it went up the wall and somewhat across the ceiling or down the wall and turned in a corner. Later in Canada, teaching at the University of Alberta, and then also continuing for very early years in New Mexico. I was working hard edge. Eventually, I began to revert back to abstract expressionism. In the early 70s, here I was working in a way that I would add layers of paint and with a high pressure hose blast elements out of the painting. Part of what I'm trying to get to in that is just in saying that I work through a lot of different ways of working, constantly trying to explore and find what paint really lends itself to at any particular time. This morning I got up and I started working at 8:30 because I know it's going to be doing this in the afternoon. It's hard to try to describe my way of painting. I've always worked at waterborne paint because water is so essential, and I like the way that water, I can use waterborne paints in a way that pigments can be deposited on alluvial tide, or I can do things where I may work from both sides of the canvas and use capillary action, drawing the pigment directly through the canvas to the front side. That's what's going on a lot in the chasm piece on black and white piece on the wall.
And one of the most interesting things about Zach's work to me is the way he collaborates with nature. That he is using the pigment, allowing the pigment to kind of express itself. And, when you're talking about water as being an essential aspect, I can remember him telling me about being in the Canyon de Chelly and looking up at the stone, canyon walls. And there are these great streaks that we call desert varnish. That's the track of water that's poured over the canyon wall, and it's nature has expressed itself. Nature has left its track, and Zach has this uncanny ability to get his pigments to kind of bring out these natural processes, especially a process of weathering and aging. The earlier piece there with the strokes like this, that I mean, they look like they have that sense of being somehow produced by a natural process.
It looked like natural process because they are natural process, and because everything that I do, I never try to illustrate anything. It is in the act of painting, and all these things again that I want to say that paint wants to do,
Yeah.
and it's material silly in different ways, and allowing that to happen.
I was very slow maturing as an artist. I was 36 years old before I figured out what I felt was the work that was finally mine. And for me, it was based on an interest in the whole of art going back 40,000 years. In New Mexico in 60s and 70s, I had become interested in petroglyphs and pictographs. And as Bill remarked, just that basic mark making. And in 1977, I finally understood that what had been constant in many evolutions of my style, one of which were attempts at narrative and figurative art, there was one constant, and that was the line. I just, no matter what I was making as a painting, if it was going to be, for instance, I did figurative paintings in the mid-70s, and also paintings of animals. But I always started the paintings by walking up to the blank canvas and just drawing lines with charcoal. In 77, I realized I could make that the basis of my work. I didn't need anything else.
As far as my practice goes, I mean, just a practical description, I seem not to have a very clear sense of what the difference is between figuration and abstraction. And so when I work, I sort of allow myself to have impulses. And that's kind of a dangerous thing. I mean, art hopes, images hope to have some relevance to the viewer. So you do have some sense of what somebody is, you represent somebody who's going to see this in some way or another. So the question is, what are you providing to the viewer? Your image is a kind of diaphragm between you and them, and that does, like all diaphragms, it prevents certain things from getting through, but you can see through them some impulse that came out to the image itself. So in that context, I'm aware of kind of, having that Richard spoke about his interest in all of art, because images are everywhere. And sometimes they're called art and sometimes they're not called art. But we live in a world of images, and they are a mysterious substance because they're kind of stand as a real thing to which you have no context except your cultural sense and some kind of physiology that responds to images as menace or as desirable. So I don't have a systematic view of separating noble impulses from ignoble impulses. And so I'm kind of follow when I was trying to think back to that original statement which I made 50 years ago, and I don't know that I want to be responsible for it.
I will never say it again.
But I think the thing that I was trying to say is that there's some kind of yearning when you make an image, and the character of that yearning is deeply personal and complex. But the society creates a set of boundaries for you because people won't recognize certain gestures, and you have to kind of negotiate a kind of effort to convince the viewer that there is a source, that some sentiment, some need, some assertion about your life or their life or the culture's life somehow exists within that place. So I think it's a tricky business, and I'm not sure that I know how to get at it. But like a lot of artists, we look at the history of art, and within the history of art, we have hints and inklings of what artists do. A lot of what they do is simply please their patrons. That's something we don't talk about so much because it's embarrassing.
Yeah,
But-
that's really questionable.
It's also like you couldn't get a dowry in Santa Fe.
Well, it's true that the patronage of Santa Fe, when we got here and we all faced it, was dedicated to the celebration of a kind of traditional nobility of image, either and including the indigenous crafts that were given a certain standing by anthropologists, and kind of as a kind of token acknowledgement of the humanity of Native Americans. And then the kind of, I do want to say there were modern artists came to New Mexico before we got here. There's the whole Taoist school came in the 30s and 40s.
In the
And they-
beginning of the century.
And earlier before that, of foreign and sophisticated painters looking for a little contact with the sort of more fundamental and basic realities of life out here. And I think we may be a little guilty of that ourselves, but that's like, I came to Santa Fe because it reminded me that I grew up in South America. It reminded me of a different kind of energy than the cosmopolitan American energy, and it appealed to me as it did to a lot of people. So I don't know where I was going with that, but the sentiment that I said about I wanted to be based in the world in some way is that I think that there is some kind of need for a force, and I'm not saying that completely abstract art doesn't have it. When I hear Zach talk about his relationship to nature, that's an affection, that is a sentiment, and that counts in some way. So he reads the work out of his relationship to these natural elements. I read mine out of my personal history and my desires, both relevant and irrelevant, and some kind of notion that I have of what makes an image that will hold the viewer's attention and maybe carry some particle of reference to an experience that I've had.
And I think that's what I wanted to bring out is for each of you to talk about the seriousness with which you approached this process and the difficulty that people have when they come to it in certain settings, and that's irrelevant in the final analysis because it's there with you in your studio working.
I was taught that the painter is doing their job when they are properly lost. When they're properly lost. In other words, so my teaching and my background was such that I was led into a position where, so de Kooning had this story to share. He said, look, remember the kids' game of the musical chairs? The music's playing, and when the music stops, someone's without a chair. And he said, there's some of us who are bringing the news that are happy to be the one that's without a chair when the music stops. Okay. And that is where I
always wanted to be, I always wanted to be properly lost because I know then that I'm doing a responsible, I'm living a responsible relationship to my art. I'm being responsible to my art if I'm going from the known to the newly known. And if I go from the known to the newly known, then if I do my job correctly, I won't know where I am, and I will be properly lost and properly fallen and properly at risk and at danger. And that's why a great work of painting, great painting, is always a moral identity before it is an aesthetic identity. Because people in silent studios bet their life on their choices, these continuous choices in present time that are made alone in solitude and your bed in your life. And also, the thing is that to really feel that I'm acting correctly, I cannot be satisfied with being in a position of the known and making sallies here and there in a comfort zone, trying out little groves of adventure in a situation of a field where I've had experience, but actually what one has to do, I think I mentioned this to Bob the other day, but the thing is that you have to peel back the wound of discovery. You have to dare to open the wound of true discovery and keep sailing. As you have these discernible experiences of the incomparably higher, the incomparably greater. But each time you reach this you don't know you've gone through a membrane of consciousness till you're on the other side. It's happened already. So it's a situation of finding the sand to be correctly lost in the work and the wonder and the newness of it, and approaching it with a total preparation, technically, in terms of your knowledge of your profession, but with reverent fear and helpless love. That's what you do.
Let's go back to materiality. I was in because I think these are words that have deep meaning and resonance for you. And these are the words that people can't relate back to the surface. And I think that's the conversation that would be useful here. And Zach, we had a conversation about this new work of yours from 2023 the other day about the practice of what it took you to get that work. After 12 years of working primarily in black and white and bringing color back, and you talked about the precision and the nuance that went into creating the painting. Will you talk a bit more about that?
Well, let me first say that over the 12-year period we have been talking about, that the work was just using black gesso on raw canvas, and that was it. And I purposely decided to work within those very severe limitations, and to see what range of expression could come about through that means. And it was so rich and rewarding that it ended up, in fact, being a 12-year period. most of the works were very Zen-like in that they were done in an instant, really, matter of moments, and they strictly recorded just a moment in time. Some of the other works began to be more layered and nuanced and working from both sides of the canvas. In all of the work, my objective, it really is one of the very tenets, of course, of modernism, is to imbue the painting with presence so that the viewer can stand in front of that painting and have an act of reciprocity, really dialoguing work. And I'm a little bit aside from what you're asking, Carolyn.
We expected that.
The sort of culmination. Yeah, I do nothing but chase rabbits. So the sort of culmination of that series of work is exemplified actually in the black and white work stand next to the piece that you're talking about, where the process is almost alchemical in it. I'm working in that piece from both sides of the canvas at the same time, applying pigment to both sides, literally drawing the pigment through from one side to the other and vice versa in this very strange kind of process that I came upon. And once I had done that painting and a painting called Looking Glass that has an open oval with all this activity around it, sort of like the event horizon around a black hole. That was the end of the series, and I felt no more need to further. It's like it happened, and I witnessed it happen, and there it is. So I had no need to go any further with it. So coming up more to your question, and I don't know where any of these impulses, you spoke of impulses, I think my work is nothing but an I began about 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, to really turn to color. I worked with color a lot of times over the 60 years, but I've come back to color, and that piece is actually that you're referring to is relatively early for it now. I mean, I look at it and it's this year, but I've done so much painting since that time. I'm having sort of a renaissance right now. And I'm not taking it for granted at 80 years old. I don't have any idea how much longer I have to do this. I'm, maintain when the sun shines, is what the farmers say. Okay, try to get back to the point. The work has begun progressively more layered and as Bill said, symphonic. He used the word symphonic recently. And I can really relate to that. So I had some vague sort of ideas of over the last 4 or 5 years that simply was, and I think I shared this with you, Carolyn, before in our conversation, that if I was to return to color again, that I wanted to work with color in a much more nuanced and richer way. So, as in all the works, I mean, I continue with these. I mean, I face the blank canvas, that void, and I just make some kind of a mark. And then I look at whatever that is and I respond to it, because my whole process has always been nothing more than establishing that dialogue from the very get-go. It's like, what are the potentialities within that color or that shape or that line or that mark, and responding to it, and respond to it. And Bryce Martin said one time of that painting boils down to nothing more than a series of yes and no decisions until the final yes. So that's what it is. But of course, it isn't always as simple as that because we make a lot of heat. And when I'm in the flow and it works, it's like I'm almost like I'm a witness to all this occurring. And then there are other times when I can do nothing but sort of put my foot in it, maybe literally or figuratively, in all the striving, and it doesn't get there. Thankfully, that's something that with maturity that I think all of us can relate to is we do it and we do it and we do it. We just built up that body memory as well as all of the emotional and spiritual and mental that enters into it. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, it's not directly speaking about it or this and that, whatever.
Right. But the process is intense. That's what I wanted to talk about. Yeah. And I want to return to a question for you, Jean, on your homage to Vermeer, because it's a very different process. That it started with the existing painting.
Yeah,
And that's the straight across from where we're sitting now.
there's a painting by Vermeer called the art that has been called the art of painting. I don't know that. And you know, the representational part of it is an artist is sitting with his back to you. You don't see his face, and he's painting the muse of memory, or the goddess of memory, and there are artifacts of, you know, referencing mortality, affection, and music and all that. I did a fair copy of that, which I don't know where it is. It's somewhere, but you know, I have you know, photographs of a kind of dutiful student version of it. And then I went through a sequence of 4 or 5 or maybe 6 paintings in which each was progressively reductive and kind of simplified the thing. I can't justify this in any kind of methodical way. I feel connected to the history of painting. I'm not a scholar of painting, but I have seen these paintings in museums. I've seen it in books and everything. And they were obviously painted in an era where most of the painting had religious connotations. Some of the more adventurous artists kind of steered a little over to the mythology side and kind of represented elements of human interest that are not sanctioned by the church. And but they represented a personal impulse of an artist that was distinct from the academic requirements of the day. And so I was kind of intrigued by this kind of coy painting of Vermeer's, where he kind of shows off his insane virtuosity, but doesn't let you see who he is. You know, so I kind of it intrigued me to kind of find out the mechanisms of excellence that are in that painting, and the kind of way in which sentiments that are kind of artificial that you give over to a painting, that a painter has seduced you to give attention to it. We haven't talked too much about the fact that in all art forms, theater, music, and everything, you got to be entertaining up front. I mean, people are not going to look at the damn thing unless they're forced by some academic whip to look at things they have no interest in. There has to be a seduction of some sort or another there, and in each of our ways of painting, we go for that. You know, we have high motives, but we also want to sucker you in to take the finger. So, so you know, there are very non-ecclesiastic things that we do in painting. And in this situation, I was interested in the sort of sorting out of the minimalist elements in that painting, and I just got involved with the painting, and so I did all kinds of variations on it. There's a little bit of a tradition of that, and of course Picasso's been famous, and then there's the famous Velázquez painting that people have done so many variants on and all that. So I was just being kind of a painter, and basically I kind of this reductive process is actually a painting that is the final one of that series where you don't see nothing.
But here we still have line, color, and composition. And I want to tell you, you seduced me with this without knowing anything about its origin.
Well, I'm
And-
glad that you're susceptible to those devices.
I'm guilty. But what you've done with space there is interesting because Vermeer is in a moment in time and people are writing volumes still about how did he do this. So in your painting, the push-pull back and forth of where you are in space is still very present, even though you're not any longer representing space. And that's the power of it. So thank you for that explanation.
Well, thank you for the regard.
And Richard, I'd like to ask you a similar question. So in talking about a word like reduction, coming to line alone is a really powerful move. And clearly you've gone on to do that for quite a while now. So in your process, moving to eliminate all the other factors to focus your attention on the line and make that line sing as it does in your paintings. Talk about that process.
I think particularly Zach spoke about the back and forth. With the earliest painting up there, what I was doing at that time was paying attention to the particular line I was drawing. I was using a brush. And I just paid attention to what was happening to that specific mark. I had no sense of why. It was like watching something come out of me. And I just moved from one place to another, but ultimately then pulling back and looking and thinking, okay, the total space needs to have a certain harmony to it. And so then I had to make adjustments to bring that. I think I just heard the word sing. It was actually at the time of that painting in 1981 or 82 that a writer that I knew saw one of my paintings in the Albuquerque Museum, and he was very excited about it. And he said, "It sings," which was exactly the right thing for him to say.
And encouragement.
Yeah, and music for me, particularly at that time, I was listening almost exclusively to very avant-garde jazz.
I've seen a picture. You have quite a stereo in your studio.
And I've gone through all different kinds of music. Zach and I have a particular reverence for the work of Bob Dylan. But at that time, I was listening to a lot of jazz, and jazz was very important to me. And I thought of my work in those terms. An anecdote is I have a cousin about my age who taught English literature in a high school in upstate New York, and I used to send him invitations. And he had no understanding of what I was doing, and said he went to the art teacher who he knew in the high school and showed her this image. And she said, "Well, you know music. Music like you have a song like Old MacDonald Has a Cow." So this is not that. This is jazz. That's that's the way, you know, I also had an interest in dance at that time, modern dance. I lived in New York in the early 70s. I desperately wanted to see one of Marilyn Monroe's street performances, but I never heard about them until they were over and connected to the right people. First time I saw her was actually in New Mexico. In terms of, again, the way I think of my work and the way it feels to me when I'm working on it, I was in the Linden Durham Gallery in 1988, I believe. It was a weekday. My show was up there. It was my work. And Linda was in her office, and I was there alone looking at my work. And I noticed a young woman walking up the steps to the gallery. And she had a dancer's walk, a very distinctive dancer's walk. And she got to the doorway, and she put her hands above her head, and she looked around, and she danced into the ring. And she danced for each painting throughout the gallery, and then danced her way out. And I think that is one of the most wonderful reactions to my work.
I wish I could dance. I only depend about art. But I understand the sentiment.
I have no understanding. I mean, music is a mystery to me, and the way people actually can do it. And the same with dance. I'm clumsy. But
She saw it.
yeah,
That's it. You liked it. Yeah.
and for me, you know, I can't play a musical instrument, but that's my instrument.
Right.
It's very clear, and it has been for a long time in Western art, easy to tell when a painting's done, and people pronounce it, that it's done when it looks like the sitter of a portrait, or when it looks like the landscape that they're painting. But in abstraction, only one person knows when it's done, and that's the artist. So how do you go about this? Because I think you've all talked about this process back and forth.
I'm not very comfortable with the idea of a painting being done or finished. I don't particularly view it in that context. I think that when the players in the arena, the actors in the arena are comfortably situated and feel no longer a need to move or be adjusted, but they're complete and content as they stand, and there does not seem to be any kind of need to adjust their situation, and they're at peace with each other. Then I leave the arena with affection, but it's not finished or done. Okay.
And yes,
I agree totally with what you're saying, Sam. That maybe just semantics, but a slightly different usage of words there. For myself, I also don't like the word finished because it sounds like dead.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm looking for is the moment when the painting comes alive.
Yeah, that's right. And I have a separate identity.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's imbued with life, and I'm not interested, frankly, in looking at any painting that doesn't have life.
No, I would say the same thing. It's just, you know, working on the painting until it comes alive. Very often it'll kind of be there, and I'll notice something and I'll think, I can even make it even better, not just do this. And then it all falls apart. So it is kind of a difficult balance there.
Exactly. The raw truth.
I don't have, I do a lot of stuff that's very sketchy. So, I don't know exactly what I'm doing when I do that, but I think I'm working my way or something or into something. So I don't know exactly when the job of finding my way through exactly takes place. Obviously, if you have a gallery, you have responsibilities, and maybe beyond that, you have a concept of a finished painting. If I have one, it's some kind of abstraction from the things I've seen. I don't have a precise sense of what that is. So
It's a very powerful question, and again, returning to Robert Motherwell, he talked about finding a standard, and when the standard was met, he tried to back away. But the operative word there is tried to back away. This impulse to keep going. So, thank you all, and let's thank these artists.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for these very tricky questions, right? You went into to the work. I think a question that is a little bit more about the context. This exhibition was built around the Renaissance of the 70s and 80s, and this is a time that Santa Fe saw the Armory Show of 1977. And I was wondering if, Sam, you could talk a little bit, since you were the coordinator for the whole, the first Armory Show. If you could talk briefly about it, and maybe also I'd love to hear whoever was in the show. I think Richard, you were in the show, Eugene, you were in the show. I'm not sure exactly if you were.
I don't know if I'm not.
And but you covered Bill, you covered in the magazine that time, so I'd love to hear your point of view as well.
Well, I'll be as concise as I can. What happened was that the city fathers decided they wanted to have an art festival, some celebration of the arts, and they did not want any living artists involved in it. We were other kind of disreputable elements in a very reputable context. We were not reputable at all. So a lot of people got together and kind of found that to be really something that we felt uncomfortable with. So we decided to have our own salon refusé, and the armory was given to us, and certain outfits, organizations backed us, and we held some elections, and three of us, so myself, I think Eli Levin and Judy Allison, were asked to be represented at the city council and say what we're going to do, and ask for their approbation. It was not forthcoming. So we did fundraisers, this and that, so on and so forth. And I was asked to delineate the structure of the show. And what I decided was that I would delegate committees to people who had groups of 8 to 10 people that were familiar with their discipline, like a photographer friend would be in charge of asking 8 photographers. An ultra, I wanted to have the ultra artists. I wanted Bill Tate I wanted Tommy Massioni, I wanted the street artists, I wanted everyone together in community on the wall. So there was people that were assigned to deal with those folks, people that were involved with mark making, with people with traditional painting, social realism, landscape painting. Everybody had their own group that they could then pick 8 people from. I think we got, if my memory's hazy on the correct number, but I think it was like 115 to 125 people. Can anybody check me on that?
It's quite a curatorial feat.
And we did it. We did it, and it was a wonderful time for community. However, I mentioned this yesterday, and I want to say it again about Jerry West. There would have been no armory show without Jerry West, because here's what happened. The panels I designed to hang from this network of beams were quite heavy, and you needed a lot of people to do the hanging. And on the night of the hanging of the show, a bunch of people we counted on didn't show up. No one came, and there were only three or four of us there. And it looked like the show was going to collapse. And who came in like the cavalry was Jerry West and his whole family. And because of Jerry and his generosity, the panels were hung, and the show was on the next day. So here's a big nod to Jerry West right now. For me. Because history has to know that Jerry West saved the armory show.
Hi, my question is for Richard, and you've talked a lot about the element of line in your work as a focus, and also a little bit about inspiration from music and dance. But something I haven't heard you talk about is the presence of light in your work. When I stand in front of the trio over here, which is beautifully installed, I feel like I'm surrounded by forest light, or I'm looking through the light coming through cathedral windows. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how your relationship to that, or how you see it, or where it comes from, its importance.
I've lived in New Mexico since 1952. I came here from Youngstown, Ohio. My parents moved here when I was 11 years old. I immediately fell in love with New Mexico. Coming from an area of the country where being able to see 5 miles was a long distance, where it rained and snowed a lot. There was lake effect weather all the time, so it was often just rains. And then it was a steel mill town, so it was smoggy and it was black soot. In New Mexico, I found light and space that initially I was so excited about it. And I think it's just always been an essential element of the way I want my paintings to look. I want that feeling there. I don't know how, again, a lot of it is not conscious, it just comes. It's in terms of wanting to get to the painting to a point where it feels right, it feels alive. That's one of the elements I think that I'm looking for. That's kind of all I can say about it.
If we could bounce back to your discussion about getting lost while you're painting your paintings, if you trust where you're going, are you really lost?
I think that was
Nope. I guess that's for me. Yes. Yes. I do trust where I'm going. I do trust where I'm going. This what the situation calls for is being to beware of the tyranny of expectation. The expectation or grasping or the desire to acquire is deadly. Okay, so the idea is to renounce the desire to acquire. Because if you have a desire to acquire or dominate the plasmic life force of the painting, what you're going to do is distort your rendezvous with the unknown.
You touched upon this briefly, but I've always embraced this notion that there are ideas that sort of float around the planet and they're snatched down in certain places, and there's, certain manifestations of similar ideas in the work of multiple art forms. And other than your comment about jazz artists and Dylan and such, I'm just wondering whether those other art forms, any other art form, whether it's film, whether it's literature, whether it's poetry, whether it's theater, whether what have you, I'm just wondering if any of you have any particularly strong cultural influences that are not other painters that you feel have made a difference in your work.
So I'm a failed trumpet player, but I would be nowhere without Herbert Brown.
Oh, it did.
The golden notes and the genius of Bird. I would be nowhere without Bird. I'd be nowhere without Coulter. Actually, there's no words to talk about how important a certain period of music is absolutely central to my working.
I would say, for me, there are a whole range of things. Film was always important to me. I had a working pattern in the early 1980s. I was living in Corrales, New Mexico. And I would start painting about 8 o'clock at night. And I worked for usually a half an hour. And then I would drive into Albuquerque. And I would go to a film. It didn't matter what the film was. I sat in the front room and I just let the images flow over me. Then I drove back to Corrales, and I usually started working about 11 or 12, and then worked till 4 or 5 in the morning. It was very important to me at the time.
I got to respond to Richard. That's exactly what Guston did. Phil was exactly, his working habits were exactly that. I mean, word for word. He was a Nighthawk movie guy, and then he would return. And you see, the thing about working at night is you have that. Picasso liked it too. I mean, if you're a night worker, the world is asleep, and you can feel your creative energy and your sand, just your grezzo, your power rolling out without interference from other folks and other life forms.
And you're talking about your work and Philip Guston's. It explains the light. You were studying light in a way by watching film.
Music has been so significant to me, and particularly all kinds of improvisational music, that if I thought I had another go around at this, I would love to come back as a musician. I don't think this is a dress rehearsal that we're involved in anything else. I don't think that's happened.
Hi there. Thanks so much, everyone. My father was David Ross. He had a gallery on Kenton Road, David Ross Studio, for about 20 years, from the 80s to 2000s. So I grew up actually on Kenyon Road. The gallery served as my bedroom by night, my dad's gallery by day. My parents moved here in the 70s. I was curious, and my dad would have loved to have been here. He loved all your work. He passed away. It was amazing. But I was curious what significance Kenyon Road had for the 70s and 80s Renaissance. if any, or maybe if you even have a funny tale about it. I saw the evolution of it in the first 20 years of my life. Thank you.
I'm willing to talk.
Okay.
Well, at one point when we lived here, we lived at the top of Cerro Gordo Road, and my road home from my studio down by where the Vladem is now always took me often to El Farol Bar in Canyon. But okay, road, and a lot of us have had a kind of sort of superior view of things on Canyon Road. But I had two personal friendships of people who had galleries on Canyon Road, and they were very, very different galleries. And one of them was, of course, Linda Durham, who I think is here, and who it should be recognized, show every one of us here. A little bit of cachet to Canyon Road. And the other one is a kind of a guy on the total other side who still is on Canyon Road, and that's Ernesto Mayanes.
Yeah.
So, and there were other moments on Canyon Road. I mean, there were exhibits in certain galleries that featured, and then, of course, there are substantial galleries there now. But at one time, that Canyon Road was thought to be in Santa Fe, and we didn't agree. So
I can add to that. Mel Olds and Jack Miller and I founded the Glory Hole Glassworks on Canyon Road. We didn't know what we were doing. Managed not to kill ourselves or electrocute ourselves in front of that glory hole. But the idea was just to kind of scrape out a living so you could paint. What's your day job? So Jack was a sculptor. Mel was a painter. And we contrived this invention that we would learn how to blow glass as we fitted the pipes. Anyway, so that was an adventure, and that was a very happy time of my life. We'd go across, of course, Bob Young's El Farol Bar at that time was called the No Name Bar because it didn't have a name, right? But that was one of the watering holes where everybody got together. There were those terrific murals by I don't remember. Yeah, no name. Yeah, but there was, you could go and have a beer after work and meet friends, and people gathered there, and that was before it became. All of you know about it. The No Name Bar became. Then it became the El Farol later. Yeah. But that was a happy place and good times.
Oh, a little too happy.
A little too happy.
I remember.
Well, that was Claus.
I remember at one point in life, my bar tab at El Farol exceeded my rent. Shit, we can put this under control.
Well, then there was Claus.
it was Claus.
Flogs too.
Yeah. Right. And I was a floor man at Claus. We're talking about that.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.